I completed my PhD here at UC San Diego in the Department of Communication, and I became really interested in gene drive as a topic while at UCSD and attending different um, meetings and kind of convenings in which different folks, developers, philosophers, folks interested in policy were just gathering to think about how we can, you know, develop and use gene drive technologies more ethically. And as these conversations were taking place, I felt there was a lot of really interesting critical perspective and, questioning of certain presumptions in the discourses about gene drive. So lots of conversation about, who should decide whether a technology like this is released in the wild. How can you define what a risk or a benefit is, and who should be part of those conversations? But something I felt was an assumption that was really taken for granted was this proposal that the first place outside of the lab that gene drives should be tested is on islands. And I'm Pacific Islander. I have relations in Oceania. It's my family's genealogical site of origin as Chamorro people. And for me, I know how much that narrative of islands as natural labs, islands as isolated and therefore sort of more amenable to experimentation, I know how much that has had consequences for our peoples throughout Oceania, whether it's setting up military infrastructure on islands or using islands for nuclear testing and things like this. So I became really interested in opportunities to sort of interrogate those assumptions within gene drive and really bringing Pacific and indigenous studies perspective to these conversations. I would say at UC San Diego, over the past several years, there's been a lot of growing infrastructure for gene drive research and development, including these, ethical conversations around gene drive. So here we have the Tata Institute for Genomics and Society, TIGS. We have the Institute for Practical Ethics. They study lots of things sort of under the umbrella of their projects, but gene drive is a major part of those conversations. And I would say that the conversations that I got to be a part of really just center around the technology specifically. Like, I feel there's a lot of sort of literacy building that I've done just to be able to sort of access those conversations around what a gene drive is, how the science works. And a big part of that conversation that I think is interesting and worth interrogating a little bit is sort of this obligation at times to represent the science correctly. I feel like as a social scientist and ethnographer who studies gene drive, when I would, give presentations on my work in different settings at UCSD, there was a lot of interesting discussion and question around, how was I going to represent the science when I go out and talk to folks who are considered lay people, right? People who don't have the technical knowledge. So there was a lot of, in my experience, sort of investment in the kinds of narratives that we're promoting about gene drive. And I think that my understanding of that was that I was seen as, if I was going to go talk about gene drive, I should represent it sort of accurately and not contribute to the misinformation that can be circulated around genetic or genomic technologies sort of in general, right? And I think it's an interesting sort of tone that a lot of these conversations have taken, is sort of this, there's a scholar named Katie Barnhill-Dilling who invokes Emma Maris, talking about this as like a phobia, so a fear of fear. So scientists or developers of particular technologies in synthetic biology or genomics having a fear of the public's potential fear of their technology. So I feel that there was a lot of conversation around, how would I represent the science if I was going to go talk to lay people or indigenous folks, and how was I going to be sort of participating in education around gene drive. So I think a lot of that has to do with just how invested certain kind of stakeholders on campus are in seeing their technologies have the chance to be deployed in the field, and their understanding of how much kind of public perception could make or break that possibility. I think in my experience doing work where I'm thinking of, what does it look like to engage particular indigenous communities in conversations around gene drive? In my work, I think really explicitly about values, right? Like, what are the values that different communities have with respect to the environment or DNA or modifying nature? And I think it's exactly right that was something that people were sort of primed and comfortable to talk about, is how indigenous folks bring certain values or worldviews to these conversations, but there was a lot less, people were a lot less likely to look at the developers or other folks' values that they're bringing. I think that just goes really unspoken a lot of the time. It kind of fits in with this myth of scientific objectivity, right? Like science, as if science doesn't have a culture or doesn't embed particular values, when of course it does. They just tend not to be named, at least in my experience, right? I've attended some engagement events, engaging, the general public, whoever that is, right, around gene drive and just vector control technologies or conservation technologies in general. But some of the events I attended were organized in partnership with market research firms, which I think is already a really interesting thing. So yeah, in that case, that looked like conservationists and biologists with an interest and a duty because of the agencies they work with to conserve endangered species. And so they're kind of, looking at a wide swath of potential technologies, including genetic engineering. And in those conversations leading up to the events I attended, there's sort of, as I learned through interviews with my participants for my dissertation work, there's sort of conversation around, sort of the optics of the work and how best to communicate with the non-technical public around these technologies. And in my experience, there was really just careful choices and strategic choices around how to name or not name certain technologies. So in the focus group that I attended, gene drives were discussed as one option of a menu of things, right? They talk about sterile insect technique, they talk about pesticides, removal of standing water, all these things to control mosquitoes. But when they talk about a gene drive, and they just didn't call it a gene drive, right? When they talk about Wolbachia, which they did, they might call it mosquito birth control. So there's these moves that are being made that are, framed as science communication, but nevertheless are being shaped by, being shaped by different values and different choices around what certain actors think the public is able to hear without, freaking out, basically. In deficit models of engagement, the assumption is that, a public or non-technical individual simply needs to be educated into understanding a technology to then feel comfortable with it or perhaps authorize its use. So in deficit model approaches, in engagement, it ends up being a very unidirectional communication. Like, the people organizing the engagement have the expertise and they need to disseminate it in a way that the public can understand and then kind of come around to sort of a, positive perspective on the technology. And so I see the marketing approaches to engagement as quite aligned with that, because that's looking more at strategic ways to present a technology or intervention. That's looking at, using market research methodology to say what will be more likely to bring people around to this or, kind of head off potential opposition. I mean, in some of the events I attended, it went as far as to kind of test out scripts for commercials, right? If you heard this on the radio, how would you react to this? Which was a more appealing message and why? And so I think it's really interesting because, in this case, I don't think it was necessarily that because these folks were working on Gene Drive, they decided to go this market route. Like, I think it's just a more embedded practice in that world, and it's one that's not really being interrogated or looked at critically, or even just reflected upon. Like, oh, why do we do this as engagement versus other kinds of conversations that could open up other kinds of learning, right? Especially if you can see folks in the non-technical public as having their own important forms of expertise or input that they can share, right? In my conversations I've had with developers and others who are, invested in kind of personal ways in seeing whether a gene drive could be used in the field, right? In some of those conversations, I've seen some openness to, wanting to do engagement differently, wanting to communicate with the public differently. And I've had folks approach me and say, okay, so we get it. We don't want to do the deficit model with the non-technical public. We want to engage in other ways, but aren't you kind of looking at me as a developer or an engineer and saying that I have a deficit by, not having these awarenesses? And I think it's interesting because I don't always know how to answer that. I don't want to like flip the deficit model on. I think that's just not a really generative way of looking at it. I think it's more like everybody has certain expertise and certain knowledge they bring, and everybody has values, and everybody has a standpoint, right? Everybody has experiences and values and biases that shape their investments, that shape how they see the world. And I think that I would like to see it become more of a norm and more of a habit for all of us to enter into conversations about gene drive, or really any technology, right, that we're talking about deploying in the natural world. I'd like to see more of a habit of having that reflexivity to name where we're coming from, name who's funding our projects, name what our stakes are and what our hopes are for it, right? Instead of taking those things for granted. In the kind of dominant discourses around gene drive or deploying other technologies for which developers want to see it contained, that assumption that islands are the right place to contain it is one that is very important to interrogate, and sort of easy for many of us who come from Pacific cultures to interrogate, because we don't necessarily look at islands as isolated by the ocean. We think of them as connected by the ocean because our ancestors are really wonderful voyagers, and the ocean is an avenue and a pathway, right? It connects us, it doesn't separate us. So that's, a perspective that that has, if you think about it, an even longer history than these perspectives that islands are sort of inherently isolated and therefore good testing grounds, right? And so I think it's important to call attention to that, just because it's so taken for granted in these conversations, especially about gene drive, just that an island would be the best place to test it before deploying it anywhere else outside the lab. How we're all interconnected and how we are in relationship, right? I think that's something that's sort of a consequence of the sort of obsession with containment and isolation, right? Is that sort of becomes a dominant way of seeing the world or seeing how things should be done instead of interconnectedness or connectivity. And I think that, oceanic perspectives have a lot to lend these conversations around gene drive, because we do think so much about interconnectedness and connectivity. And, for example, I think I mentioned that there's often a lack of reflexivity around the relationships that one has in engaging in this work, whether it's who's funding your work or what it means to develop these technologies in the global north and then plan to deploy them in the global south, and just what kinds of, dimensions of power that brings along with it, and what kinds of histories that tracks with, right? I think if we had more of a habit to think about relationships, maybe we would actually look at those things, right? But yeah, this kind of dominant perspective of isolation and containment and deep investment in that, I think, has these sort of more rhetorical and like imaginative consequences, if if that makes sense. I mean, you look at histories of nuclear colonialism and the nuclear experiments conducted by the U.S. in the Marshall Islands. You look at continued effects of nuclear testing in Mauhinui, French Polynesia, right? And people are generations later, after those weapons were deployed, people are still experiencing devastating effects of that radiation exposure, right? So, you know, neither were those weapons contained in the ways that, I mean, at least in the example of the U.S. military, like described that they would be contained when deploying them, right? It reached other areas in the atoll. Neither were they contained sort of geographically, nor over time, right? So just, I think there's sort of multiple levels at which that myth of isolation is functioning. That was something kind of interesting in my dissertation work, was that I was really grounding the project in that history of, you know, outside colonial forces coming to a place to deploy a technology. And then when I was actually in Hawaii doing my work, that wasn't necessarily exactly the context. Like, there were local folks and scientists, some of whom are Kanaka Maoli, many of whom are not, but who are interested in using these technologies for conservation. So that was one thing that I'm still sort of making sense of. But I don't know, it was interesting to see how those practices, whether the market approaches to engagement or just kind of dominant ways of talking about gene drive, still play out nonetheless, like in those local contexts. But I do think there was something, people kind of have different stakes in it if they do live in a place where they're thinking of using a technology, right? There's just a different dynamic there than someone who's never been to Tahiti in their life thinking of testing a gene drive mosquito in Tahiti, right? And, you know, I understand, like, these are really intractable problems that folks are facing around the world, including in the Pacific. Neglected tropical disease, it's really a problem. But yeah, I think you and I talked about it the other day. There's a lot of other ways that I think these issues can be intervened in. A gene drive is one, but I'd like to see more investment in some of those other things. At a really basic level, I think there needs to be an awareness of these histories that are not really being engaged when we talk about something like a gene drive, right? I think, you know, even just having more of an understanding of the kinds of things our university is implicated in, different funders are implicated in, right? Like, I feel like there's no one's really naming that or interrogating it. I know in the near decade that I've been at UC San Diego, you know, aside from the sort of ways you become aware of the militarism just from the things you see and hear every day, or, you know, you drive up the freeway to visit someone in LA and you go through a border patrol checkpoint. Like, all of these things are kind of do make you aware of the sort of everydayness and regularity of militarism, but at the same time it really is erased from our education around this university or this city, right? I mean, I see people doing interesting work to try and, you know, kind of unearth those narratives more in art and film and things like that, but in being at UCSD, there's not really regular conversation around, you know, that history. We need to rethink how we do engagement and the stories that we're telling about the technology. If the story about the technology is, you know, teaching people Punnett squares and understanding inheritance so that they can understand a gene drive, then, and that's the whole story. Or if the story of I should say, if the story of a gene drive is starting with these sort of urgency narratives, right? Like the consequences of malaria, the consequences of environmental degradation, like, and then that's sort of the framing. It just leaves a lot out if the technology is then introduced as the intervention or sort of sole intervention, right? I think we're ignoring the very complex political and economic and social conditions. We need to be open to telling different kinds of stories when we talk about gene drives, because I think it's very common to focus on educating folks around the technology, right? It's very common to surface certain ethical questions and considerations, about gene drive. There's lots of talk about negotiating trans-border decisions and movements of these organisms. There's lots of talk about who should make decisions and all that, but I think that we need to broaden the lens even further to think about the kind of social and political and economic contexts in which these technologies would be deployed, right? Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Technologies are not created in a vacuum, and I think it would be really helpful or a generative, at least first step, to start, speaking some of that into the narrative when we talk about gene drive. So that includes really being open to naming, who some of the major funders and developers of these technologies are, and what that means, what the histories of our institutions are where these technologies are developed, or the organizations are. I think we tend not to talk about or reflect on that, in my own experience at least, when we talk about gene drive. Where does the story of a gene drive start? I think that is such a good question, and we should continue to think with that, because I don't really see us talking about history like at all when we talk about gene drive, or when I see engagement activities around gene drive. It always starts with defining the technology and building some literacy around the technology. So I think there needs to be some investment in kind of restructuring and rethinking the training of a lot of folks who are developers or may become developers of these technologies to, be able to do that kind of reflexive, thinking of themselves and their own position, and then be able to bring that to bear in the ways that they talk about their technologies. I don't know that I fully have an answer for how we can start to do that, but I do think that in this moment where I'm seeing a lot of interest or renewed interest in thinking critically and broadening the expertise that we bring to the table, like, I would like to see more self-reflection on the part of folks who stand to gain something from these technologies being deployed too, Folks in science studies or history of science, they're the ones who are able to bring these narratives to light, but that's just not those are not the stories that are told when I Google a gene drive and try and educate myself on what a gene drive is, and certainly not the stories that are told when I frequent these spaces where, people are working on these technologies.